So yesterday we talked about the Civil War and the results of it. So although certain laws were passed, we know that these laws weren't necessarily being upheld by our government. So today we are going to take a look at some of these protests, boycotts, and strategies that were used that helped lead to equality. So we are going to use this framework sheet to help gather our data. We are going to write down our main ideas and our essential details as we discuss them. Although we will discuss many different details, we're only going to write down the most important ones on our frame. And the frame will help you keep track of your own thoughts, and it will help you organize them so that you are better prepared. So now I will hand out your own frame. I want you to follow along with me because we are going to decide what we're going to put on here, and we are going to discuss it as we go. I want to make sure that your guys' matches mine because maybe you'll get to use this on the test, and I think that would be very helpful for you. So the first key topic that we are going to talk about today is the civil rights movement. So right where it says key topic, I want you to write down civil rights movement. All right, so what does civil mean in this context?
Like civilians?
Okay.
People?
Yeah, and how about rights?
The basic things that we should all have.
Nice, good summary. And movement, not like moving around, but in this context, what does movement mean?
When people are trying to work together to get something done or to change something.
Awesome. All right, so where it says is about, we're going to write civil rights movement is about, and based on what you just summarized for us, I think we should write citizens trying to achieve equality. So if you can write that with me, citizens trying to achieve equality. Great. Okay, so now I want you to discuss the rights that we as Americans have today. You can discuss this with the people sitting around you.
Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, safety, equal opportunity, the ability to be successful and to have due process, and I guess just to have an equal chance.
All right, so then after they discussed with their groups, we'd come together as a class and we would discuss them together. But since I already heard his, that was awesome. So, do you think that these rights have always been fair?
No.
No, of course not. We know this. So although we have these rights today, there were many barriers that stood in the way from African Americans trying to reach equality. So people used peaceful protests to bring awareness to these issues that were preventing African Americans from getting these rights. So therefore, today we are going to learn about peaceful protests and how they brought about change to a time of need. So we are learning about this to raise awareness and also to prevent something like this from happening in our future. So now we are going to go over these 4 main ideas that make up the civil rights movement. So I will describe each one in order and give you a little summary, and then we will go on from there. So the first main idea I want you to write down is Montgomery bus boycott. So that's in the first main idea box. Montgomery bus boycott. All right, so we will discuss what occurred during this protest, how long it lasted, and what the results were as it came to an end. Then the second main idea I want you to write down is Little Rock 9. So in that second main idea box, Little Rock 9. This had to do with resolving segregated schooling. So we will discuss why this event took place and the problem that occurred during the event. Then the third main idea I want you to write down is Greensboro Sit-In. So Greensboro, Greensboro. Greensboro Sit-In. So we will discuss how this sit-in protest impacted the city of Montgomery, Alabama, and how it increased the United States' attention on the civil rights movement as a whole. Then for your fourth main idea, I want you to write down March on Washington. March on Washington in that last main idea box. This event happened towards the end of the civil rights movement, and there was a big law that was passed as a result of this. So we will discuss that further. So each main idea has these essential details that go along with it. We will discuss them and then write down some of the essential details that we think are the most important. So for many people, the Montgomery bus boycott was the beginning of the civil rights movement. Back in 1955, African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus and white people were allowed to sit in the front of the bus. So why do you think this is? What benefits did white people have by sitting in the front?
They could get on and off quicker.
Huh. And this happened daily, even though 70% of the bus riders in Montgomery, Alabama were African Americans. One day, though, a lady named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. So what happened was a white man got on the bus and there was no room in the white section near the front. So the bus driver asked the African Americans that were sitting in the front if they could please move to the back of the bus. 3 of the African Americans obeyed and they got up, but the lady named Rosa Parks did not obey and stayed in her seat. So why do you think she refused to get up?
She didn't feel it was right.
Yeah. So let's first write down Rosa Parks as our essential detail because she had a major impact on this movement. So after her arrest, people stated that they thought the reason why she wouldn't get up is because she was tired. This is a direct quote from Rosa Parks. She said, "I was not tired physically. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." So how would you feel if you had to continuously, every day, give in to those around you?
Not great.
Yeah, I can imagine she did not feel so great either. So after Parks's refusal, a boycott began throughout the city where they started to boycott public transportation. So can you tell me, or someone, can you tell me what boycott is that we had learned from our last lesson?
When you refuse to go to a business or service.
Yeah, nicely done. So the boycott began where African Americans refused to ride public transportation. What do you think happened to the city and the bus company as a result of 70% of their riders refusing to ride?
They lost profit.
Yeah, absolutely. So in our essential detail, I think it's important to know boycott public transportation because that's essentially what this event took place. So boycott public transportation. That goes in your second essential detail. All right. So this boycott lasted for 381 days before bus segregation was finally deemed unconstitutional. So I think in the next essential detail, we should write down how long the boycott lasted. So how long was that again?
381 days.
Yeah, 381 days it lasted. And then what was the result for our last main idea?
Deemed unconstitutional.
Yeah. So segregation was deemed unconstitutional. All right, so our second main idea was Little Rock 9. This occurred 2 years after the bus boycott. The protests occurred as a result of Brown v. Board of Education. So for this second main idea, we would discuss Brown v. Board of Education, the first African Americans who attended the Little Rock High School, how they were treated, and what role the National Guard, the judge, the governor of Arkansas, and the president all played in this big event. And then what occurred as a result of this event. But for time's sake, we're going to move on. So throughout this main idea, I would continue to have students actively engaged, and we would be discussing and completing this second main part of the frame outline. All right, so for our third main idea is the Greensboro sit-in. And this occurred 3 years after the Little Rock 9. So this protest occurred at a lunch diner in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 African Americans sat at the all-white counter, and they were denied service because this diner would not serve any African Americans, let alone one sitting at the specific white spot. So for our essential detail under Greensboro sit-in, I think we should write refused service. Do you think this strategy is effective?
The sit-in?
Yeah. Do you think it's effective to sit, like as an African American, to sit in a white section and try to fight for your...
I guess it puts you in the public eye pretty quickly.
Yeah, we're actually going to discuss that here shortly. So the students actually stayed until the store closed, and then they returned the following day with even more people. This movement spread to 55 cities and 13 states. So, as you just addressed, how do you think the movement spread like wildfire? Well, they gained a lot of attention through the media. So let's write for our second essential detail under Greensboro sit-in, let's write spread to other states, and then right under that, media. So, more peaceful protests, just like this Greensboro sit-in, actually started to form after the media had seen this big event. So other locations were like the library or beaches. Those were 2 main ones where they started to perform these sit-ins. So what do you think the benefits are of peacefully protesting in other settings instead of just diners?
I guess it would raise awareness to the segregation in other areas.
Yeah, awesome. So we want to write spread to other settings as our third essential detail. Spread to other settings. Right, so the first African Americans that actually got served at this diner were their own.
Stop. Ready? 3, 2, 1, go.
So the first African Americans that actually got served at this diner was the diner's own African American employees. So this protest lasted from February all the way through the beginning of summertime. So this is quite a few months for no service between African Americans. So how would you feel if you worked your butt off for a company and you weren't even allowed to eat the food that they were serving there?
Not good.
Yeah. So for our last essential detail, I want you to write down employees got served first. So our final main idea would be the March on Washington, and this drew attention to many of the inequalities that African Americans face. So for this last main idea, we would discuss where the march took place, how many people attended, who spoke at the march, and then the Civil Rights Act that was passed shortly after the march. So many open-ended questions would be asked to keep students involved, and the key elements would be written down in the very last column. So what tactics were used in Montgomery that were significant for the later civil rights movement? So if you look back at your frame.
I guess they boycotted.
Yeah. And did they do so violently or peacefully?
Peacefully.
Yeah. So if you look back on your frame at all of these different events, what do they all have in common?
They were peaceful.
Yeah, absolutely. So why was nonviolent action so effective in the civil rights movement?
Because it got a positive viewpoint by the media.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say because African Americans were looked down on as being these bad people, and hereby peacefully showing that they were actually good people, that drew even more attention to the movement. Now, is the Black Lives Matter movement today similar to the civil rights movement that occurred in the 50s and 60s?
In a lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. There have been a lot of peaceful protests. We know that there has been a lot of media coverage surrounding this movement as well. But all in all, I think it does have a lot of good implications that the civil rights movement from back in the 50s and 60s had. So, what's one way we can combine what we learned into this last statement, our so what statement? So, what's so important to understand about this topic?
That they were peaceful protests that got media coverage and spread across the country, and it took a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's write peaceful protests can change unfair laws. But it may take a long time and many people putting in the effort. Does that kind of summarize what you were thinking? Awesome. Okay, so I want you to look over the details listed for each main idea and, in your opinion, rank them from most important to least important, with most important being a number 1, and then the second most important being a number 2, and so on. So just the main idea section up top. Montgomery bus boycott, Little Rock 9, Greensboro sit-in, and the March on Washington. Okay. Then I want you to discuss with the people around you the reason why you chose your most important choice and your least important choice.
I think that the Montgomery bus boycott was the most important because it kind of got the entire process rolling. I think that the second most important was the Greensboro sit-in because it started to open up the awareness of the fact that people who even worked at a place weren't getting served by that place. I think the March on Washington was ultimately as important as both of those two things, but I put it third because I believe that that's where the biggest change was made. And I think that the Little Rock Nine was the last important, although not unimportant, because it ended up resolving segregation in schools, which is a very big deal.
So then we would regroup as a class, and I would call in a few people to go over their most and least important. But again, for the sake of having less students and less time, we're going to skip that. So let's review what we learned today. So what is the civil rights movement?
Citizens trying to achieve equality.
Awesome. And what are the main ideas that helped spark this movement?
The Montgomery bus boycott, the Little Rock Nine, Greensboro sit-in, and the March on Washington.
And why do we need to learn about the civil rights movement?
It was a very important piece of American history. It's laid the groundwork for a lot of the way that our society works today. It's a constant and ongoing struggle.
Good answers. Okay, so now let's talk about the framework sheet really quick that I provided for you. How did this help you learn the information today?
I guess it gave us a big idea and then the important or key components to each of those ideas so that way we could understand the core concepts of it.
And how can we use this same framework sheet in a different setting? So whether that's a different class or a different part of your life, how could we apply it?
I guess we could focus on the main ideas and what is the most important points of each of those things.
Yeah. And now, my last question for the day. What are you going to do with this framework sheet when you leave class today?
Keep it so I can use it on the test.
Good answer. Okay, well, that wraps up our class for today. If you have any questions, as always, come see me. Otherwise, have a good day.